Escaped Sapiens.
This is a conversation with Steve Callahan, inventor, sailor, naval architect, and author, and a man with one of the most remarkable stories of human endurance and ingenuity of the last half-century. Steve survived 76 days lost at sea when Napoleon Solo, a boat he designed and built, was sunk in the middle of the Atlantic during a storm. This is a story that ranges from an adrenaline-fueled escape from a sinking boat to long drawn-out days of starvation, thirst, and internal self-reflection, to the joy of salvation and a second chance at life. We discuss facing adversity and picking yourself back up and finding life after tragedy. I found this conversation and Steve's perspective on life refreshing and uplifting. Those who find this conversation interesting should check out Steve's writing, and in particular his book Adrift, which I link in the description below. Enjoy. I guess there's only a few people on the planet that really have a story like yours. I mean, there's John Glennie, but there's only a small handful, right?
Well, if you're talking about ocean survival specifically, no, we're a pretty limited club. Thankfully, long-term ocean survival experiences don't happen too often. Many of them aren't well publicized because they'll, like, for example, I was working, when was it, almost 2010, I guess, or 11. No, sorry, 2012. No, it was 2010. Sorry, I'm gonna start this all over again. In 2010, I was working in Taiwan on a film, The Life of Pi, and there was a few islanders out in the Pacific who had, they'd set off from their island to go basically pick up girls in the next island, and next thing you know, the engine quit and they went off, drifting for 50 something days. Those kinds of stories don't tend to get as publicized as mine for some reason. Us Westerners get a lot more press than other people, fairly or unfairly. And but even so, it's still a pretty eclectic club. Probably every few years, 3-4 years or so, somebody goes adrift for a month or more, but not too many people. I guess if there's a claim to fame that I have, it's, I survived the longest alone in an inflatable raft, but there's a lot of qualifications there for that. And from my viewpoint, and I think most other ocean survivors' viewpoints, you really can't compare experiences especially based on time. I'll tell you a little kind of humorous story. This happened a long time ago, right after Adrift was published. They sent me out, the publishers were thoughtful enough to send me out on an author's tour, which to me was sort of a mixed bag because I was kind of horrified by the media as well as taking advantage of it. And I was giving a press interview, I believe it was for the San Francisco Chronicle. And I kept being asked, is this some kind of a record? This was from the time I landed, basically, and getting questions from people. Is this a record? Is this a record? And I said, it's not a sporting event, and it's not the Olympics. And find this guy, I was explaining to him, that it wasn't a sporting event. It wasn't really important, the length of time, that there are all kinds of variables. And, I said, I could be the first guy to sail around the lighthouse backwards with my pants down. And I guess that would be some kind of notable record. And the next day my publicist called me laughing, and she said, have you seen the paper? Because there was a picture of me with a caption underneath. Callahan says about his experience, it was like sailing around the lighthouse backwards with his pants down. So
they completely misrepresent you no matter what you say.
Yeah. I mean, the experiences have, I guess, relevant and important aspects to them, no matter what the length of time. In fact, not long after I landed, I talked to, I was kind of hitchhiking my way up through the Caribbean islands on boats, and spent some time in Antigua with a couple of sailors there. They were kind enough to put me up on their boat. And this guy had been shipwrecked in the Galapagos Islands for, I don't know, the boat hit this island, went down immediately. He and the crew were lucky to just get off the boat. Most of them were like naked or near naked. And they're on this volcanic island. Their feet are all cut up. There's not any shade. There's not any source of water, nothing. And they were fortunate to get picked up. I won't go into the whole story, but there's a excuse me, relatively short experience in terms of months or whatever, it's 8-10 days. But in that environment, it was every bit as trying as what I experienced, in my view.
Have you met any of the in your you had a duffel bag, right? During you had a bag during your ordeal where you had a book written by Dougal Robinson or someone. Did you ever meet him?
I didn't meet him, although we both worked on a survival manual called Survivor by Michael Greenwald. We were both sort of contributing editors to it. And so I had a little bit of correspondence with him, but unfortunately I never got to meet him. I never got to meet Maurice and Marilyn Bailey, who I would have. I really missed the opportunity there because I had been going to England, and they were in England. And I think Marilyn had died by the time I could have met Maurice, but I wish I had. I've seen some interviews with him. I did a sort of a podcast kind of thing with a guy who interviewed him at some length, and just a remarkable individual. I would have loved to have done that.
He seems like a really nice guy. I couldn't get over how nice he seemed watching that interview, actually. I have seen some.
Yeah, just very thoughtful. But that came across in his book as well, as far as I'm concerned. And of course, we all share many feelings and observations when we're in these situations, and there is a lot that I could relate to, and I certainly was extremely thankful to have read the Bailey's book and Dougal Robertson's Survive the Savage Sea, and of course he also wrote the survival manual that you mentioned that I carried, and they were fundamental in my survival in numerous ways. I mean, I read their books when I was much younger. They happened a lot earlier than my experience in 1982, even, which was a long time ago now. And I think one thing that we all get from, I don't know, whether it's listening to a podcast as somebody who's had these kinds of experiences, or reading their books, meeting them, is that we don't just learn something in a sort of technological way or detailed way about, how to survive at sea, I mean, like, how many people are really going to be in that situation? But it's just inspiration conceptually, because we learn from them some commonalities of the survival experience. For example, one of the biggest ones is that I've talked to, not only from my own experience, but I've talked to dozens and dozens of survivors through the years of all kinds of experiences, and one real commonality is in the initial stage of the survival experience, or one of the initial stages, once you sort of escape the immediate threat and you're in for the long haul, like maybe your company's gone bankrupt or whatever it is. Hardly anyone feels like they can get through it. It's just an incredibly depressing time. And it's a stage after, like, the immediate impact and escaping and so on, that might be called recoil. But a lot of people survive that initial impact. They flee the house on fire or whatever it is, only to perish in years after, or days after even. And it's because your whole old life has kind of gone away. It's flushed down the toilet. And you kind of look around you and go, how can I possibly make it? Even if I know it's possible intellectually, you just feel like it's impossible. And yet we all find that we're way more resilient than we ever thought we could be. Now, it doesn't mean everybody will get through that and be able to transition into the survival routine, as we call it. But but that is a commonality amongst the survivors, is that it's not like we're like all he men and he women, and we think, oh, we're going to beat everything in the universe, even if we're well prepared for it and so on. Once you're in the thick of it, it's really, really difficult to get yourself psychologically through that period, and to end in a physical as well as intellectual way, to get into a period of adaptation where you're basically creating a whole new life for yourself. And Maurice Bailey was beautiful about that in his writing, I thought, and it was something I could not quite directly relate to, but it's also a commonality. Once the situation kind of comes to a close, when rescue is there or some other successful conclusion, there's a sort of a bittersweet feeling about it amongst survivors that I've met. I know, I'm presuming the story of Alive. These guys who were, well, guys and women whose plane crashed in the Andes, and there was absolutely nothing to eat. They ended up having to cannibalize, people who had died in the plane crash, and just a horrendous situation. And I had done a television show with a few of those guys when the movie Alive came out, and we were talking in the green room separately. And Nando Parada, I believe is his name. Excuse my memory, is not the best, but he was kind of the de facto leader, and he and I were talking over in the corner about, here we are with all this hoopla and media and society and so on. He said, sometimes I just wish I was back in the mountains again. And the Maurice Bailey had a section in his book once, after 104 months, they're out there drifting around, sort of aimlessly in the Pacific, and finally a ship sights them and comes up to rescue them. And he has this passage in his book talking about, he has this sort of bittersweet feeling about it, because here they had adapted, they had created this whole life, and they were sort of kings of their own universe. So there is element, we discover things from these experiences that are incredibly valuable to us. In my case, I can certainly say that I learned I was a lot stronger than I ever thought I would be, or could be. But I also learned a lot about my weaknesses and things that I really needed to work on or compensate for one way or the other, which was equally important. And you develop these, I don't know, in my case, I think anybody who's read Adrift can see, I hope they can see through it, that I'm out there bobbing around the ocean, and it's really not my environment, even though I was a seaman, so to speak, and thought I was a pretty good sailor in Voyager, but it was clearly pointed out to me I was not a sea creature. And yet through this experience, I felt probably more connected in a spiritual way to the universe than I ever have through any other way. So we go through these experiences, we suffer, they have tremendous costs to us, but in the final analysis, we're gifted things that we could only experience through going through these kinds of experiences. So it's just sort of a general thing that I hope people can, a hopeful kind of message to people who are suffering, who are going through things that they've never faced before, never imagined they could face, in extreme difficulties in their life, is that somewhere buried in that stuff, there is the possibility of positive elements that will emerge.
But I mean, your situation was very immediate, right? A lot of the troubles that people face today, in some sense, you were struggling with, you could die any day, right. Whereas a lot of the problems that people face in their own lives, I imagine you spoke about regret while you were in the life raft, regret of having not done certain things in your life, or not having succeeded in certain ways. Did those problems, the sort of problems that most people would feel, have in their everyday life, did they seem insignificant to you after your ordeal, or was there, you know, did everything sort of become easy once you were back on dry land and you?
It's sort of a mixed bag, to be completely honest, and a lot of it has to do with time. Um, I would say after a while, I get back into my own bad habits as well as good habits, I suppose, and I can bitch and moan with the best of them. I get very easily frustrated, which is true in the raft as well. I could get very easily frustrated and curse the ocean regularly and curse myself and curse everything, you know. Um, but also, it's also true that once I came ashore, it's like nothing bothered me at all, and that can actually get to be kind of almost dangerous at sometimes because I think survivors, we figure, oh, all right, we've gone through that, like whatever, we're kind of accepting and probably a bit too self-confident in that sort of immediate aftermath stage, and we can do risky things without really appropriately measuring the risk.
So your risk aversion is much lower now after the event, would you say, or have
Well,
you built that back up?
I was never that risk averse, actually. In fact, that was probably a foolish thing on my part. From a fairly early age, I mean, I was running around in the woods and very comfortable in sort of, in all kinds of wilderness environments. I was probably much more comfortable in wilderness environments and with nature than I was with people. And I don't know, doing adventures just appealed to me from a very young age. I think I like most young, no, most or all young people, you kind of have a feeling that you're a little bit invulnerable at that age, or you have a very long, many years, no matter what happens, ahead of you. And so I think when I was in college, I thought, I'm never going to live to age 40 anyway, but I want to do these things before I get there. But it's really different when the rubber hits the road and you're there and you're starving and you're in pain and you don't have enough water and you have no idea how to get through the day, not to mention through the week or through the months to reach rescue. So one thing that I think is a common theme in Adrift, actually, in even kept me going at the time, is I don't know, anybody who reads it, I kind of divide myself into these different personalities in a way. There's a rational and a physical and an emotional part of me, and they all have different needs, and they're all vying with one another at times. And that rational part's coming in there and trying to separate the physical from the emotional. The emotional doesn't want to catch any fish, it's really attached to them, it honors them, they're spiritual creatures, all that. And the physical part of me wants to eat every one it can possibly get, and right now. And the rational part's sort of mediating between the two. And part of the reason, I mean, that's an abstraction, it's not quite that clear, but I am very firm in the belief that we're very multidimensional creatures, and that we don't just think one thing, we don't just feel one thing. If we really look into it, that let's say, I don't know, just abstractly, you're getting divorced, it's really traumatic. And I've been through this myself, so I know it's very traumatic in many respects. You can have anger, you can have fear, you can have envy, jealousy, you can have all these different feelings, and also relief and all of that. And the same thing happened with me on the boat. I write about it very early on when there's an impact on the boat's going down. I get up on the deck, I'm trying to free my equipment, getting in. There's a part of me that's being Mr. Wimpy Weenie Whiner, and you're gonna die. And there's another sort of rational part of me that's gone through the training and says, shut the hell up and just put you aside for now and do what you need to do. A part of me that gets up on the deck, and there's a movie camera on the back of the boat, that has somehow magically come on. I guess the electrical system fused together or something in the seawater, and I come on and was amused by it. And all these things are going on all at the same time. And survival experts, survival psychologists talk about this, about this confusion that can put a lot of people into a state of sort of almost catatonic freezing, or spur them into completely dysfunctional, panicky behavior. And there's a certain percentage of the population in general, about 15%, we'll say. I mean, it varies depending on training and all kinds of other things, but there's a percentage of the population about the same size as those who are panicking and being totally dysfunctional, that is able to psychologically split themselves, that they realize there are all these other voices, but they can figure out, this is the one I need to follow. This is the one I need to listen to for now. And most of us, like 2/3 of us roughly, can be pretty highly functional in those crises moments, but it really helps. They don't really know what to do. So they will have either dysfunctional behavior or functional behavior, sort of the roll of the dice, unless they have effective leadership, if they're in a group. And if you're on your own, and if you're on your own, hopefully you've had training, because we know that training through studies of oil rig fires and various other catastrophes, the training does have a definitive effect on survival.
For the listeners, can I take a jump back and sort of slowly enter your story? Because there's people who won't be familiar with the story at all. So I was wondering, did you originally get involved in naval architecture because you were interested in going out exploring, and that was sort of a path to adventuring and getting into the world?
Not Well, I'm not sure exactly how to answer that. I'll give you. My father was an architect. I grew up drawing. I always liked drawing, and designing. I had what we can call a pretty decent 3-dimensional eyeball. I could look at 2-dimensional drawings, in different perspectives, and kind of see what the shape would look like in 3 dimensions. That probably came from my parents. And I, putting things together, building things, like I say, growing, and also wandering around through, I felt comfortable in kind of wilderness environments. I grew up in a very woodsy area and whatnot, and started sailing at a fairly early age. And it just all appealed to me, this having experience. In fact, it's sort of prioritizing experience over, I don't know, ownership, if you will. And I was a child of this, sort of the child of the 60s, growing up as a teenager and into young adulthood through the 60s and the 70s. Culturally, that had an effect on me. I was all part of the back to the land movement in a way. I was running around working on boats, actually started building boats, and that came from high school. I helped a guy build a boat, and after college, I started, there were a lot of people doing, building their own boats to go off and create a lifestyle, a fairly simple lifestyle at sea. And so I was involved in that end of things, and my first wife wanted to do organic farming. So we came to Maine and, bought a falling down farmhouse and started working on that and stuff. So I don't know, it was all about simplicity. And I guess one really big influence on me when I was very young, just after I'd started sailing, I was reading a book, actually a few books, but one in particular. Robert Manry wrote a book called Tinkerbell. He had taken a 13 and a half foot town class sloop that was built for, in fact, there's actually the picture of it's right here behind me.
Oh yeah, the one with the red sail?
With a red sail, yeah. It was, basically to sail around a lake or something or other. And he eventually decked it over and sailed it to England with no fanfare, whatever, and that was a huge influence on me, because that and some similar voyages showed me that boats are incredible human inventions. They're a combination of dwelling and vehicle and art. And all of those things have appealed to me since I was at a very young age, and a very efficient use of materials and space that give you, on, especially for something like Tinkerbell or Napoleon Solo, the 21-foot boat that I built, it's basically your ticket to 2/3 of the world, plus all the interesting crinkly edges all around the most populated parts, at a fairly low cost and low impact on the environment. So all these things came together for me through the years, and design was just sort of an extension of that. To be honest, I don't really picture myself as anything. I'm not really a builder, a designer, an artist, a writer. I've dabbled in all of these things and somehow cobbled together a living through the years. But I've been blessed by doing things like being a journalist myself and traveling all over the world, picking really smart people's brains and whatnot, to realize that there are a lot of people out there in every field I've dabbled in that are way smarter and more talented than I am. But I've just been kind of really had kind of a blessed life in terms of being able to taste all these different parts and put them together into a I don't know, a sort of rambling life.
Has our technology and our communication system now made it sort of so that you can't have one of these adventures these days? I mean, if you had been stranded today with the technology that's available today, and you had, I suppose you still sail and still have a boat, right? If you had your current boat and you were stranded, would you have been 76 days at sea, or?
It's a lot less likely. Just to kind of update your viewers who don't know, I mean, I was shipwrecked in 1982. At the time, we found our way around the oceans using a sextant, and things like the internet for the public did not exist. The cell phones did not exist except in a very sort of primitive state in a few countries, mostly Scandinavia. I was never fond, even today, if I was to go across the ocean, I'm not really big on like sitting there and chatting on the radio. As Eric Taberley, the great Eric Taberley, incredible offshore sailor, once remarked, if I wanted to talk on the phone all the time, I'd stay home. So, but the reality is the communications are much better. I had an emergency beacon that would send out essentially an SOS, which was a fairly new bit of gear back then, and was only being monitored by aircraft. Now they're all being monitored by satellite. Not only are they being monitored by satellite, but you register it and they know exactly who the signal comes from. And they're much more accurate than they were. Now that doesn't mean they don't malfunction. It also doesn't mean that there are a lot of parts of the world, in fact, that are so remote that even if your boat goes down and somebody gets a signal, there may be nobody within days and days and days of being able to reach you. A little story about that: I was helping a friend sail a kind of wacky multi-hull boat called a proa, which doesn't tack and back and forth like sort of Western boats do, but it actually changes ends and the whole rig turns around and so on. It's a sailing canoe. And we went sailing off from California, eventually him all the way across the Pacific. I went as far as Tahiti, and we went out for 2 weeks and saw absolutely zero sign of human habitation of the earth in that 2 weeks. It'd probably be different now. There will be even more trash than there was then, but we didn't see any trash. We didn't see any contrails. We didn't see any ships. We didn't see anything. And, the realization, which I often talk about, is that we who go offshore, shove offshore and you experience an incredible amount of freedom, but you also have total responsibility. And you are more isolated from humankind than an astronaut circling around the globe. I mean, at least they're in
Mhm.
constant communications and all of that, and they're constantly passing over land and constantly seeing human habitation everywhere. But the sea is a very empty wilderness, and
This is what I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you if you still saw the ocean as, a great frontier, or whether, the ball had shifted to now, Mars exploration or the deep sea or something like this. So you still very much see this as an active place where I could go get a boat and explore and see something that really no one else has seen before, to some extent.
Well, I don't know about nobody seeing before, but experiences are very, personal and very unique. And I think that whether you go to, I kind of have a fondness for wilderness environments, because I think you have an outward journey, but you also, through that outward journey, also have an inward journey. And you reflect on things in different ways than you do when you're like surrounded by people and having all this input all the time, and all of that. And but the sea itself is pretty unique in that it's still a pretty it's a pretty wide open space. and and nobody's going to be there to get you. Well, maybe somebody will be there to get you out of the trouble you get yourself into, but you can't count on that. And at sea, I find Murphy's Law is optimistic that not only can everything possible that can go wrong, but even the things that can't possibly go wrong will figure out a way going wrong. And you're responsible for dealing with that and keeping yourself going, and that gives you a different kind of relationship to everything, to the universe. And certainly if you're with mates and whatnot, you're literally depending on one another for your life. And so you develop different relationships with people, with yourself, and most importantly probably with the universe. I mean, I had a philosophy background, and so I like to think about abstract things, and how they apply to concrete things. And so it gives me space out there. I actually haven't been able to get offshore now for some years. The last, I don't know, 8 years or so, because of personal health issues. But and I miss it terribly. But even just going down to the shore and looking out on it, I find inspiring, just the same as I do looking up at the stars. That my wife and I are both real fans of astronomy. So when you talk about all these environments, the deep ocean, the surface of the ocean, space, they all offer me a kind of a similar feeling about the universe and in our relationship to it.
So in terms of your big voyage, where you took out Napoleon Solo, or is it Solo Napoleon Solo?
Solo, yeah.
Was that your?
Yeah.
Was that your? Sorry.
No, it's just a TV personality from when I was a kid.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
The was that one of your first solo trips out? Was this, had you crossed the Atlantic previously, or was this
No, that was
it was the first time?
yeah, that was the first crossing of the Atlantic. But I took baby steps all along the way. I started sailing when I was, I don't know, 13, 12, 13. I'd been messing around in boats since I was a very young boy, like, I don't know, 8 or 10 or something. My brothers and I would whack together these like little barges and go on a pond behind our house, and do little wars with one another and stuff. And when I started sailing, it just felt really natural to me. I felt at home there. And the guy, my mentor, was a wonderful man and would let me become a full partner on the boat, really, from a pretty early age. And by the time I was 16, he had this 25-foot boat that we would go voyaging off. And we had already been taking trips like from Boston up to Maine and stuff. So they're offshore, a couple of 100 miles or something or other, it takes you a couple of days to get there. And those sorts of things. And he started loaning me. He's just said, "Oh, take the boat, take your friends out, whatever." And so I would take friends out sailing, or I would borrow the boat and start single-handing before I was out of high school. I taught myself celestial navigation as a senior project. And like I said, I was helping a guy build a boat. I was completely obsessed. I started sailing, doing real offshore trips, like the States to Bermuda in, I don't know, the 70s, early 70s, I guess. And I just really love that, doing these offshore passages were fantastic. So I was doing quite a lot of that, and I had done, I'd single-handed to Bermuda, and then a friend met me there on Napoleon Solo specifically, and then we sailed the rest of the way to England, the two of us. I always preferred double handing to single handing, but I'm okay, I guess, by myself.
But so you had already seen large storms. You were already
Yeah.
confident with repairs, and so it wasn't like it was your first rodeo.
Oh,
But
no, 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 not at all. But I wasn't. I mean, I thought I was, fairly experienced, but I was far from being, and now it's like everything else. Everybody blows records away all the time, and now there are these young bucks, especially in France, where sailing is really a national sport. It's like football or baseball in the United States, or soccer, football, your football in the UK or Germany. You know, the newer, it's always getting better and better and better. Whether it's, what you see in the Olympics today is just like blows away what people were capable of doing, because you learn more, and you're standing on the shoulders of people who came before. So at the time I was relatively experienced, but now there are these, these sailors who are 30 years old, have been around the planet like 8 times and stuff like that. It's just so it's different. And certainly I've had, since I lost Napoleon Solo way back then, 80% of my experience has been since then. Spent over 50 years messing around in boats.
But so at the time you felt fairly confident though, and you had damaged the boat just before you had the big sinking, right? You were going to take part in a race, and
stuff happens. I made a mishap immediately leaving Newport. I was eating breakfast, and I was like, oh, the wind was coming up some, and I was like, oh, I'm going to take down that sail, and I screwed up and took the mast down. So I had to jury rig it and sail it back to Newport and put a new mast in it, and then we set off, and we had a pretty uneventful trip to England. And at that time, you have to realize, there had been some boats, there'd been a number of boats, I guess, probably 20 or 30 boats, probably that size, that had been across an ocean. But it's still a pretty small club. And we had a wonderful trip. We went through one gale where we got knocked down pretty badly as the boat, went over more than 90 degrees. There was, green water across the hatch and whatnot. We were both inside at the time, fortunately. And but the boat popped up and it was fine. And then we got to England, and it was, typical crappy North Atlantic conditions for the fall, coming into the fall, and lots of storms, of course, across the mid latitudes. And one sailor actually got killed on the way to the race in a big storm that we managed to miss. Another sailor we'd met in Bermuda had left a little after us, and Hurricane Emily had run him over, and he got there, was terribly beaten up, and so on. So, and then we started in the race, which started sort of not quite in a gale. It was okay when we actually started, but a gale was coming up, and a number of boats were lost totally. And Napoleon Solo had some damage. I'm not sure whether I hit something in the water or whatever. There's all kinds of junk out there floating around, barrels and trees and all kinds of stuff. I'm telling you, it's just an amazing amount of stuff that you can hit. And I withdrew in La Coruña on the north coast of Spain and spent a couple of weeks there, sort of repairing things, along with a number of other boats that had withdrawn from the race that had pulled in there. And then from that point on, I was just basically cruising. And the original aim was to circumnavigate the North Atlantic, to come to, sail from East Coast US to England, which was the big goal because it was something I'd wanted to do since reading Tinkerbell, Robert Manry's book, when I was 13 or something. And then from then, because the mini Transat race at the time went from Penzance to the Canary Islands and then to Guadeloupe, you kind of complete most of the circuit. And I figured, well, I'll get to Guadeloupe. My marriage had fallen apart anyway. There was really no reason for me to go home. And I had a friend or a guy I met in Newport actually before I left, who lived in St. Croix, and they had started a boatyard there, building multi-hulls, in which was a big love of mine. So I figured, well, maybe I can get a job with Roger because I'll definitely be broke and, I'll be living in my little boat and whatnot. So that was all part of the plan. And by the time I withdrew from the race and cruising down Spain, Portugal, out to Madeira, down to the Canaries, it was just really a nice kind of cruise. And then the easy part of the trip was supposed to be from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean because it's all downwind with the trade winds and all that kind of stuff. But of course, the best laid plans of idiots like me always go to awry. So
what happened? So you're on the way between. So you'd gone from the east coast of the States across to England for a race. Then you bailed out of the race and went down to Spain and then to the Canary Islands. And then on the way back to I guess the Caribbean, this is where you had a big storm, right? And where things went south.
Yeah, there was a gale, but like as you mentioned, Napoleon Solo and I had been through several gales together, probably 4 or 5 at that point, and she'd always done well, so I wasn't particularly worried. Of course, I had repairs that I'd done in Spain, and so I kept. I left the Canary Islands on January 28th, I want to say, of 1982, and got about 800 miles west of there, which puts me kind of in the middle of the Atlantic, a little bit closer to Africa, but for all intents and purposes, middle of the Atlantic. And a low pressure system was coming through, a bit of a gale. I had about 3-meter waves or so, significant wave height, and so I kept getting up and kind of looking around at the boat, looking at all the joints in the boat, and even getting up on the deck and making sure all the rigging was good and all of that. And then I'd lay down and I'd get up a while later, and these waves were kind of smacking the side of the boat, but we were making pretty good time, and I had shortened sail and felt okay about it. And then I lay down, and I don't know, probably around midnight-ish local time, there's a big bash on the side of the boat and big hole, and water came like really pouring in, and I knew immediately that the boat was doomed. Mm-hmm. And so I basically, the short story of adrift is I got out there in the middle of the Atlantic, something hit the boat, I bailed out before it sank, and spent the next 2.5 months learning to live like an aquatic caveman. That's basically the story.
But so you immediately knew the boat was going down. You just woke up and water was pouring in. There was no doubt in your mind that this was a problem.
Oh yeah, definitely. I had watertight. The boat was designed with good rewriting characteristics because I figured a small boat, any boat can get turned upside down in bad conditions. And so I sort of planned on that. I figured any 21-foot boat that's going to go across the ocean at least once and probably, hopefully twice, there's a good chance it's going to go upside down at some point or pretty close to it. So I had it designed in a way that it would rewrite pretty well. I had watertight compartments designed into the boat, but they weren't. It's such a small boat. It's like imagine living in a camper van or something, like a VW microbus or something like that. It's basically that kind of space. You can't stand up anywhere in it or anything like that. And so making watertight, you can't make the whole boat watertight compartments because there's no place you can't move around in it then. So I had some that were supposed to contain damage on the ends, especially like if I hit something forward or something like that. but seemed to be a blow that came from the side and hit the main compartment. So it wasn't really designed to stay afloat in that situation. And I knew it was kind of doomed, but fortunately for me, the boat stopped almost immediately and nosed under. Basically, the forward 2/3 of the boat were actually underwater, but the back end of it developed a little bit of an airlock, a little bit of a bubble of air inside, as well as the aft compartments, watertight compartments and all of that. And so it was just above the water. But the problem was these large waves coming by every single one essentially was washing over the boat, which made it impossible to stay aboard. And I was hoping to stay tied to it until morning, at least, where I could see things. And I took the chance to get back on board because I said, well, if I do get separated, I know there's some equipment in the raft, but I have a bag, a ditch kit, basically with all kinds of goodies in it, little important pieces of equipment that I wasn't able to get out initially. And so I dove back down into the boat and got the bag out, got a piece of cushion and a sleeping bag and stuff like that. But I was hoping to stay tied to it because I also had 5-gallon jugs of water. That's like a 40-day survival ration of water right there. I had bags of food and all that kind of stuff, but I got broken away from the boat just before morning, unfortunately.
Because it was so rough.
Yeah, it was very rough. It was almost like being in an auto accident every few minutes, because the boat is like a very effective sea anchor. It's not moving much of anything. It's sort of like a whale sitting there. You're tied to this whale, and the raft is bobbling on the top of the surface. So every wave that was hitting the raft was just like collapsing it. And I was afraid that the raft might get torn to bits. So like everything else, that's another theme or other themes in Adrift, is that, there's sort of yin yang balances in everything. And the paradox it surrounds you everywhere. Dilemma surrounds you everywhere. Irony surrounds you everywhere. And so, finally this wave hits and there's this relative peace in the raft. It felt, it's like, I poke my head out and see that I'm drifting away. And it's like, oh, damn, I'm in the middle of the ocean. And, this is what I've got. And it's not looking very pretty for your future. But on the other hand, had I stayed tied to the boat, maybe the raft would have gotten ripped up before morning. And I'd be left in the middle of the ocean with no boat and no raft. So, everything's a mixed lesson.
But so when you first woke up, was the boat it was filling with water. So did that make the boat still, or was it sort of really chaotic inside the cabin? The lights were out, I'm guessing. Was it really difficult to get out into the lifeboat to start with?
Yeah, it was a challenge. It was a bit of a challenge. Yeah, like I say, imagine standing in front of a fire hose. Yeah. That's kind of what was coming at me in the boat. So yes, it's dark inside. There was a moon. There was a lot of scud and stuff, in the sky, but there was moonlight. And I'm used to, wandering around at night with no lights and stuff. In fact, I don't really like lights at night unless you absolutely need them. So that was okay. It wasn't a matter of seeing, because a lot of it is just sort of feeling anywhere, and I knew exactly where everything was. But it was filling up with water so quickly. I was like trying to free my ditch kit, but the water was coming up over my head, and I said, "Oh, that's it. The boat is going straight down, and if I don't get the life raft off, I'm done." So I got up on the deck, and it's, the motion is pretty incredible. And like I say, all the waves are washing over it too. So you're trying to stay on this, it's a bit of a circus ride, and you're trying to be functional getting the raft off. And, you're supposed to throw this thing, which weighs 100 pounds, into the ocean for inflation. And I don't know, it's a bit chaotic, obviously, but I had gone through the motions a lot, and I had spent enough time offshore where I dealt with lots of issues, lots of problems with boats breaking in various ways and stuff like that, and having to deal with it. So I think I was pretty good at dealing with that, to do the psychological splitting, to focus on what I was doing, and to get off. That was okay. That sort of escaping the immediate threat. The next stage of it, which is the recoil stage, or what I call disorientation and fear, is a totally different matter. That's when I look out, the next day, well, first of all, it was stormy for several days, so it was a matter of just hanging on. But then, you're in this incredible ocean that, looks like swimming pool clarity, just beautiful, but devoid of life initially. You realize I'm like 2,000 miles away from where I am going to drift, whether I like it or not. It's going to go with the currents and with the wind, and that's going to be the Caribbean islands. And that's if I'm lucky enough to not miss them, get swept up in the Gulf Stream and end up back in England or something. And so the challenges are just immense. And in that period of time was, kicking back basically, and trying to conserve energy and stay warm. Actually, staying warm was really, really a big problem for the first half of the voyage. And at night, and during the day it was okay, but at night it was cold enough, and I was wet most of the time initially, and overall in the voyage I was probably wet half the time. So, and you start breaking out, and saltwater sores, which in a week they start off like little blisters on the skin, and then they break open, and you end up with all these open ulcers all over your skin. It's just being soaked in salt water if you're lucky, or when it dries out, encrusted salt everywhere, being ground into these things, and not very pleasant. And then starvation, starts, and being very limited in water supply, which is even worse, of course, because that, being without water can kill you in days. Being without food can kill you in weeks. So you don't worry about the food initially, but the water was a real problem. And in hypothermia, losing body heat was a priority. So I'm starting to go through the motions of survival, but in the meantime, that big part of my mind is beating me up about oh, you were horrible at relationships, you blew your marriage, you were never good with dealing with money or business, you never succeeded at really doing anything of value to yourself or anybody else for that matter. And so my life just seemed like a very empty waste, and that I would have let down a lot of people, and here, this is the result of it. All for what? So yeah, it's hard to get through that stage, but slowly there is that rational part of me that says, shut up, start doing what you need to do, pump up the raft, start keeping a log. So there was that part of me that was from the very beginning, taking the attitude that it wasn't the end of the voyage, but it was just the continuation in a much more humble craft. And so I would do shipboard routine stuff. I get to keep my log and navigate, and exercise. I had been doing sort of yoga exercises, and even modified yoga exercises on board the boat, because of course it's moving around all over the place, so you have to modify things. And so I developed my own routine for the raft, which I did every day, unless I was like completely out of it, and those sorts of things. So I would go through the routine, and then learning how to fish, learning how to produce water, all these other things. It actually can be, early on, it wasn't even a full-time job. Actually, after I adapted, it took me a couple of weeks. And then, of course, I'm sitting here going, God, how complicated how do we all make our life? I'm living in the middle of the ocean in a rubber tent, working for a few hours a day. What is my thinking about going back, to civilization? But then, of course, things break down more and more and more, and in survival really it ends up being kind of a full-time job.
So originally, you get into the rescue craft, and then you dive back into your boat under the water to get various items at the very start, and then so The next day when you wake up, what do you have on you? You've got your sleeping bag. What was the list of items that you had to survive?
It's quite a list, actually. I won't go through it all, but it's listed out in Adrift that exactly what I had. But there were some, I had this bag which was, I don't know, probably I guess maybe 16, 18 inches wide by a couple feet long by 8 or 10 inches high. That was full of gear. I had a Tupperware box that I could catch water in or whatever. And that housed things like I had these little pads of paper, dime store pads of paper and a pencil, which I consider one of the most important survival tools that I had, especially psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
Then I had just bought a little teeny spear gun in the Canary Islands that just basically fit in that bag, and that would provide me with virtually all of my food. I had a couple of solar stills plus one in the raft. These were produced during the Second World War, these sort of balloon-like things. I'm not going to go into the details of explaining them exactly because it's kind of complicated, but let's just, I guess each one I learned several things, and especially in the last 40 plus years, is I've never found anybody else to get one to work in the real environment. And the second is that once I figured out how to use them, I had to use them not as directed, and each one had its own personality, which they needed tending to all the time. And if I was lucky, I would get maybe a cup and a half, 2 cups maybe in a day or something like that. Probably a cup in, what is it? A pint. I mean, a couple of cups, I guess, is what I would live on for the next 2.5 months. And each one would wear out and so on. So anyway, those were in there. I had bits of line. I had Dougal Robertson's survival manual, which was incredibly helpful. I probably read like 20 times. Even though I knew it, but it's just to read. Oh, what was that? Now I got to make sure about that, because you're not sure you're thinking right all the time either. I had, a pump to pump up the raft, which needed to be done all the time. I called it the Beast because it's really a foot pump, but you can, in a raft, the only way you can use it is squeezing it with your hands, which isn't, and I had to do this like hundreds of times a day sometimes. So I don't know, a few sponges, and I had a heap of closed cell foam. Closed cell foam is important because it doesn't absorb water, and that was what I was using for cushions in Napoleon Solo, because I figured it's going to get wet in there, and they're stiffer. But the good thing is they don't absorb water, so you're not sitting on a complete sponge all the time. And I had a sleeping bag, which was quite wet a lot of the time. But it did provide some insulation, also a space blanket and whatnot. And those did serve me well. I was cold a lot of the time, but obviously I made it, so it was good enough.
So when did you start fishing? Did you immediately have access to fish, or did it take some time before?
It took a while. I mean, the core story of Adrift is that I'm just kind of this idiot, clumsy human observer of this incredible environment that evolves, and of which I am blessed to be a part of. And it's about my relationship with this environment and being a part of it, not a dominant part of it for sure, but a small interactive part. And it's about the magic and the mystery of this environment, which is really mostly symbolized through the Dorado, also called mahi-mahi in places and whatnot. They're fairly large fish that are found in temperate waters around the world. They're incredibly beautiful. I found incredibly smart, actually. I know that a lot of scientists in recent years have been discovering that fish are smart. And I'm like, well, haven't they talked to any fishermen in the last 2,000 years? Anyway, these fish started showing up within, I think, the third day or so. And eventually the school would form around the raft, follow it. I felt like they used it as a point of, you're in this, the world's largest desert, really. But as far as you're all moving with the current, but as far as if you're in that current, everything's moving. It's like everything being on a moving sidewalk. You're kind of all going at the same speed, so it's like everything's sort of sitting still. But there are no signposts or anything out there. And I found that the Dorado were social creatures. And I think, and so they would come and gather around the raft, and there would become more and more and more of them. There were probably over 50 fish by the time I landed off Marie Gallant. And barnacles would grow on the bottom of the raft, and that attracted triggerfish, which was actually the first fish I caught. Was smaller. The Dorado I tried fishing for, and initially, I'm shooting at them with the gun. You have refraction problems and stuff like that. So it took quite a while. It took me 2 weeks really before I started catching fish. And there was a lot of practice involved. And then I thought, then they scared the hell out of me because, the first fish I caught, they seemed to have a social reaction to it. It was like I don't know if you ever saw the old movie Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, but it was kind of like that, the fish, and they were like determined to get me, and they were just relentlessly smacking into the raft and whatnot. And these fish are pretty big. There are cases of them being landed in boats and knocking bits of the boat apart. And I'm fishing for them with a spear and an inflated raft in the middle of the Atlantic. So it was kind of disconcerting at times. They were really pretty powerful. And the floor of the raft is just like a 16th inch of reinforced rubber. So you're feeling every little bubble that goes across, and they would constantly hit the bottom. And the big males sometimes, like if you press down on it, an elbow or a knee, that's what they'd aim for. So I had to be careful to keep my head up off the bottom of the raft, because it'd be just like if I came along and slugged you as hard as I could in the face. So I try to stay away from that, but eventually I could use that technique because the power strap to the spear gun would disappear eventually. And so I needed to get them even closer. And I used this bumping that they would do to the bottom of the raft to my advantage. I pushed my knees down in front of there was like a little opening in the tent that covered the raft. And I pushed my knees down, and they'd bump into that and kind of slide out in front. And it would give me I had this whole technique I had to develop, but I have a split second in order to aim and fire and hopefully catch a fish, which would normally take me a few days before I actually was successful. But you learn patience.
So they began that behavior after you had caught one of them.
Well, they do they do rub. We're not really sure why they do this behavior, but they do rub up against the survival craft, and other people have noted this as well. But what I mean was, like, after I caught the first fish, they seemed to go into this kind of frenzy, and I don't know how many they were, but they're, in terms of actually smacking into the raft, because I'm inside most of the time, but it was like bam, bam, bam. They just wouldn't leave me alone. And I was freaking out about it, just firing the spear gun just to kind of drive them away and stuff like that, which was just nonsense. But, you're not always acting the most rationally in those situations.
Which is probably why it broke eventually.
What, the spear gun?
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I say, it's a really tiny little frail. Actually, you can see that.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that the one on the wall behind you?
Back there, up here, that's it. And that's all tied together, as you can see, and whatnot. I go into detail about all that stuff in Adrift, but you don't need to know all the details. But it had this whole evolution to the end. Even the tip of it, there one point, these fish, they, as I say, they're kind of symbolic about a lot of the magic and the mystery of the sea, and certainly their dominant position over me, really, in our relationship, our love-death relationship with one another. And because they sort of provided me with virtually all of my sustenance. They became my friends. I could know many of them individually. They just were incredible to me, spiritual creatures. They in the end, the final part of the story, of course, is they actually bring my salvation. But in the meantime, they also almost kill me. At one point, they break the spear. That's one reason why it's tied all together like that. They broke the spear off the and turned it around and rammed it into the bottom tube and ripped a big hole in the bottom tube, which just about killed me. And I had a temporary repair that was working for a little bit, and I was gonna try to fish again, and I spear another one, and it did this kind of little break dance in the water and swam off. And I looked at the end of the spear, and I'm dumbfounded that it had unscrewed the tip of the spear and left with it. So they're like a butter knife and something tied onto the end of the spear for the point. So it had a big evolution.
When you tore the boat, how did you fix it? I was looking at a few other interviews and things about how you repaired the hole. I don't understand at all how you managed to repair this hole.
It's a little it's pretty difficult to explain verbally. That's why, yeah, in Adrift, go if you look in Adrift, it'll show you exactly, and it actually has a photo of what the repair looks like. It looks like a mess, but in essence, if you think of the tear as a mouth, but think of your mouth as being inflated with 2.5 psi of oxygen as well, which is pretty stiff. Like, it's not quite, car tire stiff, but it's pretty stiff. And so, you blow as hard as you can, you're going to blow out your mouth. So first of all, I tried to put like a tongue of foam, closed cell foam in it, and wrap it around the mouth, pucker like that. And it would just stretch, as soon as the pressure would come on, it would stretch the mouth off and the tongue would fall out. And, and then all the bubbles come out and I was back in the same position. And then I tried external pressure patches across it. I did all kinds of stuff and just tie it tighter and tighter and tighter. I was wearing a hole in my arm from, jerking on this thing, pressing against the raft. And it was a nightmare. And I would get it to last, you get the repair to last for kind of an hour or 2 hours or a few hours, and then it'd blow out. And it was like, after days and days of this, it was, I just didn't think I had any more strength to deal with it. I kind of collapsed in the raft and felt like, no, this is the end, and kind of slapped myself, started crying and whatnot. And so sort of another part of me beating myself up and saying, snap out of it. You got to deal with this. But it's like, I don't care anymore. I just don't have any more strength. But then I was kind of going through all the equipment I had in the bag, and I'd had for, I don't know why, but I had this like utensil kit, a little stainless steel camping utensil kit in there, and which included the knife that ended up on the spear, and a fork. I was like, I don't need any friggin' fork, and so I was like, oh, guess what? It's stainless steel and it's a pen. One kind of unifying concept amongst survivors is that we stop thinking about things in their normal context, that we look at them for their prime qualities instead. And that can either be a person, your job, whatever job you had doesn't really mean anything. It's what are you good at, and if your job required you to be good at mathematics or something, that might come in useful. And so in the same way, this fork was, okay, it's stainless steel, it's stiff, relatively stiff, and it's without the tines on it, I can break those off. It's a pen, and so I could take that mouth and cut some. That's another unifying concept. Sometimes you actually need to make more damage in order to fix something, and so I cut a hole in the top and the bottom lip and put the tongue in, ram that pin down through, and that gave me something stable that I could wrap around lines behind it. It didn't matter how much pressure was coming out, it couldn't force the lines off the pin unless that pin broke. And in the end, that it actually improved the bottom tube. It ended up holding air better than the top tube. I don't know why, but it was kind of a little miracle. And this is another thing about, the kind of the survival experiences that you go through. It's really normal life. It's just on, normal life on steroids, as we say. You have problems you deal with and successes, and you go through ups and downs. But in a survival situation, the ups are incredibly high and the downs are incredibly low, and one can follow the other in moments. So, you know, the hole in the bottom of the raft, I'm going through this really desperate low. And then when I actually find the solution to the bottom tube, I am totally wasted, but it's probably the highest I've ever been in my life. You know, I felt like, king of the universe. Brilliant. And, you know, I designed a boat. One of the first designs I designed was, I called it Mr. Toad. It was a little catamaran, a little cheap catamaran. And it's on the Wind in the Willows character, because I could always relate to Mr. Toad, who's a character in that. And, you know, it's a children's book. It's a brilliant children's book. Anybody who hasn't read it should read it, because it's great for adults. It's great for kids. It was one of the first books I ever read offshore. A friend read it to us. And Mr. Toad is this, you know, all full of bluff and blather, and, you know, oh, I'm Mr. Toad, the brilliant Mr. Toad, the wonderful Mr. Toad. And then 2 minutes later, he'd get himself into all kinds of trouble, you know, by being too proud or whatever. And then it was, oh, poor Toady, Mr. Toad, you're so stupid. You're so, oh, how could you be such a failure? And that's been my life to a large degree, and especially in the raft, it was like that. You know, I was definitely a Mr. Toad, where, you know, 1 minute it's like, oh, woe is me, you know, and then the next minute it's like, yes, you're brilliant. And
did you have any? So I'm guessing repairing the raft was what your key moment of brilliance. Was there anything that after the fact you thought of that you went, I should have thought of that? You know, your rescue.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah.
What's any main ones?
Well, there's one I often tell, and in fact, I think I finally included. I wrote a new like introduction to the book, and it included the story. It was a while after I'd been back, and well, of course, I came back in 1982, and it took me 4 years or so to put my life back together and to write this book. And then I was doing sort of media tours and all of that. And when it was published in 1986, and in 1987, it was one or the other. And I was doing a radio show with some kids in New York. You know, there, because a lot of kids like it. You know, it's an adventure tale, especially for younger people, and you know, it can kind of be read on that level. And this young precocious man, about 10 years old, got on the phone and said, well, you know, I'm a little confused. You know, I read in your book that you were never successful at catching the Dorado with hook and line. And I said, yeah, you're right. You know, because I tied the first one, I had this piece of line and the Dorado just bit through the line. So then I went through all my gear and I found a piece of wire, and I tied that on there to use as a leader, and the Dorado hit the lure, and as soon as it knew it was hooked, it swam fast forward and just clipped the line off right ahead of the leader. And he says, yeah, but then you complained that you didn't have any more wire to try fishing again. And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, you say early in the book there's like a little light on the top of the raft when you get into the raft. And I said, yes. And he said, and you describe how it's driven by a little saltwater driven battery down in the ocean, didn't you? And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, like, wasn't there a wire running between the battery and the light? And, you know, it never occurred to me. Not only had it never occurred to me, it had never occurred to any one of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of adults who had ever read the book. So I was like, yeah, next time I'm bringing you along, kids, because
years after the event as well.
Sorry?
And years after the event as well.
Yeah, years after the event. You know, I knew when I was in the raft that I was making mistakes. I knew that I wasn't the smartest guy on the planet. I knew that I wouldn't necessarily have the best solutions, and I the advice of other people. I was very conscious of that and missing the advice of other people. Or for that matter, I mean, I had to, I couldn't be on watch all the time. So, maybe if I'd been with somebody else, they would have seen a ship that didn't pass me by. I mean, 9 ships passed me by, but they, there are so many ways that somebody else might have helped me, but then again, I didn't have enough water for 2 people, so probably both of us would have died. So everything's again this sort of yin yang balance. But I'm looking back on it, I don't think I made too many horrendous mistakes. And actually think I did overall. I'd give myself a B plus maybe.
I think that's even being too harsh. There's a lot of people who don't come back.
Just in a Mr. Toad kind of way. Tomorrow I'll feel differently. I'll give myself a C minus.
I guess you mentioned that you had these solar stills and you had to destroy one of them to work out how they worked. But right. I mean, if you had that extra solar still and an extra person, maybe that combination would have been the ideal.
Well, maybe. Again, it's you're constantly facing paradox. And part of that is, if I use this piece of equipment, it's not going to be useful for anything, it's going to be used and that's it. So you have to ration everything. You have to ration, not only your equipment, the use of your energy, all kinds of things. And what is good is also bad. That's the paradox. Like, it's good I've solved this problem, but it's not good because I don't have it to do something else with. And so the first solar still I used as directed. And part of the problem was the raft now was very much like Napoleon Solo with the life raft. My raft now was the more stable part, in this little balloon that was made to float on the top of the ocean is just sort of bobbling there, very, very light. And every wave that would go by would take it to the end of its tether and boom, shake it. And it violently shook it enough that it actually put a tear in it. And so now I've got this inflated thing that's pretty useless. I don't have any material to fix it with. We take a very specialized, I tried fixing it. And so finally it's like, well, this is useless as a solar still, and I can't use the other ones because they're obviously not working the way they're designed to work. So I cut it up just to kind of figure out, okay, what is really going on here in this thing and how does it work? And then I figured, oh, well, I'll try using it a different way. And so I figured out a way of getting it to actually work, which was actually tying it onto the raft. And it had its downside too. And another one of these things, this sort of dilemma of, do I do this because there's this cloth on the bottom of it that makes it work basically. But that cloth is now wet a lot and then drying out and wet a lot and drying out, and it's going to rot. And indeed it did. Each one had about a month of life to it. So it was just one of those things, that dilemma of, do I destroy something in order to figure out a solution? Is it worth it? There are no right answers. They're just what you do. And you can't beat yourself up. I did that a lot. I was like constantly reminding myself, you're doing the best you can, but also giving myself a hard time if I wasn't doing the best I could. This is a situation where you can't cut yourself any slack whatsoever. You got to be on 24/7. You got to be like somebody at the Olympics, but you got to be in the zone as much as you possibly can, because any little mistake and that's it.
What I find kind of remarkable is, you designed and built your own boat. You single-handedly sailed it across the Atlantic and sort of halfway back. And then you had the sort of wherewithal to dive back into your sinking boat to, save some equipment. Then you successfully rationed your water and food. You were able to do all these different things, and then you were able to, you made the decision to tear up your solar still. You must be an incredibly mentally resilient person. And so I'm wondering, was there a point where, because you had no one else there, that you really broke down and you noticed yourself go? Or did you have moments where you noticed you were acting sort of in a crazy way and you had to sort of, say no, your rational side had to take back over?
Um, yeah, basically. Like I said, I can be a pretty volatile person. Um, I can get really angry. I can have a pretty short fuse. I can get frustrated very easily, and there was no exception to that in the RAF. I would like, for example, early on in I was going through this kind of gale conditions for a while, and the RAF would never turned upside down. I'd had this, I don't know, this kind of drogue thing I was using, and but it would tip up on end and scoop up all kinds of ocean, and I had just dried out, just bailed it out, and every time it does that, you're in danger of losing equipment and all this other stuff. It's a real nightmare. And so I remember one day where it's like, I get almost knocked down, and I get bailed out and everything, and then boom, here it comes again, and here it comes again, and I just flip out, and just yell and scream and cry, acting like a 3-year-old. And there was that part of me, that kind of rational part of me, that was saying, "You're acting like a friggin' idiot." I don't know, maybe people don't have this experience, but I have this all the time. I can fly off the handle having an argument with somebody, and there's that voice in me going, "You're being a dick," But then there's this other part of me going, "I don't care," you know. And that rational part of me, I think, sort of somehow knew, it's like, look, just get it out and then get on with it. Give myself 10-15 minutes of there was this guy I knew. There was a very early single-handed round the world race back that actually started just when I came ashore in '82. I was covering it, and this guy came back, and there was a brilliant section of footage of him in the middle of the Southern Ocean in his boat where things are going wrong, and he just lets loose, cursing every curse you can imagine over and over. And like, at first it's kind of astounding, and after 5 minutes you're laughing, and it goes on for like 15 minutes before he gets himself under control, and it's hysterical. But that this is what we have to, especially when you're by yourself. You have nobody else to lean on. You have nobody else there to say, "Hey, just calm down. I'll deal with it," or whatever. And so, yeah, I lost it a lot. My wife hates it when I curse at the ocean, but but I do at times. Like, I get frustrated and whatnot. And certainly, when the fish hold the bottom tube, I mean, I came to a point where physically I didn't think I could do it anymore. I was at the end. But something that kept me going through the entire experience was not just Dewey Robertson, these other successful survivors who came back and shared their tale with everybody, but it was also the real knowledge that of how many people in history, even in this very limited oceanic kind of history, have been here before, have been smarter and more resilient than me, but who still didn't make it. And I felt that presence a lot. And I felt like those people helped me to persevere. I felt their company, and I felt it gave me a sense of purpose. I think that's another thing that almost all, certainly all I've talked to, all the survivors share, is that you have to have a sense of purpose for getting through it and coming back. And part of that early stage, I think, of recoil is developing that purpose. For me, it was like, well, if you're lucky enough to get out alive, guess what? You will have an opportunity to rebuild relationships. You have a different focus on what is really important in life. You know what your weaknesses are, and you'll be able to compensate for them or improve in those parts. and you're also able to hopefully capitalize somewhat on the strengths that you've learned, and to be able to come back and give those people who didn't make it, who are smarter and more talented and more resilient than me, kind of a voice, to fulfill their
Mm-hmm.
purpose.
Mm-hmm. So do you think, do you think sort of the regrets you had over portions of your life, do you think those were actually, so they were in some sense a motivating factor in your survival?
Yeah, I do. In the long term, I mean, they were hard to face and deal with, but yeah, definitely.
It's interesting because, I would be thinking, this is not the time to be thinking about these, but actually, yeah, it was maybe exactly what you needed.
Yeah, but
One thing
plus, everything has its own time, and we're all, I think, human beings. We're all so vain and proud, and we're just more creatures, and we all have huge limitations, and part of that is our predictability. I've often said that we're a lot more complicated than psychologists would like, and a lot simpler than we would like to be. Really. So we do tend to go through, if you look at individual or group survival experiences, they're very natural kind of behaviors and experiences, it's stages of the experience that we share. They're not universal, but they are common. So you kind of have to go through all this stuff. Now, people will choose. The thing that fascinates me most in life is that so many people, you can take any kind of situation you can imagine, and you can put a group of people facing that situation, and they will react differently from one another. And it's like, why is it that somebody like me, or I have friends who are real adventurers, for example, like this friend of mine lives in New Zealand, like, I'm gonna go up to the Arctic and freeze myself into the ice for the winter, and learn about man's relationship with nature in such an environment, because I'm really interested in how indigenous peoples relate to their environment and how it shapes their cultures. That's his shtick. And to me, it's like, oh my God, that's horrible. I mean, there's no place I would less rather be than frozen into the ice in the Arctic in the winter. But for him, it's exciting and interesting. And you look at this all the time, whether it's people in sports who are able to do these things, and you look at these adventures that are able to face fears that or deal with things that would like put us all over the top of being scary. Going swimming with great white sharks, not my thing. But for other people, it's exciting. And so what's interesting to me is that we can have the exact same experiences, but have very different relationships to that experience. And that really, in terms of like what I went through, is really important, because a lot of people would just freeze up. They just would. We know that.
Mm-hmm.
And they wouldn't make it. And then other people would do better than me. But most people are kind of in the middle. Almost all people would find out that they're way more resilient than they ever thought they could be. But you don't know till you're there. And a lot has to do with experience, training, what becomes the norm. Somebody mentioned this the other day, and I realized this about sailing at a fairly early age, that it stirred up fear. It also stirred up excitement, and that there was a very, very close relationship between fear and excitement in a physical way. Your blood's pumping, you got your, I don't know, it's doing something to your pheromones, and you're doing what is it that's hyping you up in your blood, and what am I trying to think of? It's going to mental block here. Adrenaline, yeah, huge adrenaline rushes, right? And some people are able to take that adrenaline and kind of,
channel
it into, this is exciting, this is fun. And other people are like adrenaline, and it's like, this is horrible, this is fear, this is panic time.
Mm-hmm. So you're one of the first.
I guess, but I think a lot of that is because of my entire background.
Mhm.
I people I read and all that kind of stuff, and also my own personal experiences of running around and dealing with things. I was kind of made to work from a very early age and put things together and fix things and be responsible for stuff and all of that. And it's all part of the soup of who we are. We like to think that we're in total control of ourselves, but
Mhm.
I don't think so. I have one of my saying, kind of my sayings is that, you show me a self-made man and I'll show you somebody who stands on a few billion people's shoulders.
Mhm.
We're not who we are by accident or alone. We don't make ourselves.
This is actually something I was particularly curious to ask you about. So, did this give you some insight into control? Because, I mean, this is a situation you were thrown into. There was no way you could magic yourself onto the shore, the next day. So, did this give you some particular insights into the way that, we have control? What can I do as an individual to position myself in life? Did you gain any insight there?
I don't know about specifically, other than what I've really said. I guess, my view overall, and a lot of things about being in the raft wasn't like awakenings, but strengthening,
Mm-hmm.
elements that I had believed in before. Like I said, I was a philosophy major. I'd studied a lot of religions and spirituality of different sorts, as well as non-religious principles and uh, I don't know, logic, all those kind of things. And I was always interested in a lot of ideas and exploring those. And certainly being in the raft gave me time to sort of re-explore a lot of that stuff. Certainly in terms of my relationship with the environment and the fish and everything, it's sort of, I consider myself sort of a scientific mystic. Um, and I could bore you all day with, kind of my personal outlook towards, religion or spirituality and stuff. And I'm not going to do that, but I don't really, I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer that in a cogent
Mm-hmm.
way. I think it awakened a lot of things in me. I had, in a visceral way, I was awakened to many of the things I believed in, like the relationship that I had with the fish, and by looking out, like for example, um, they were following the raft and they would go off during the day and hunt flying fish and stuff, and but they would keep coming back to the raft like a point of rendezvous, and then at night they would just sort of gather around the raft and pace it. And things that go through the ocean at night, they stir up the little bioluminescence in the water.
Mm-hmm.
It's just magical. It's one of the nature's most incredible beauties to me, and that's reflected all in the stars. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away from any humankind, any light pollution or anything, there is no bigger sky country than the ocean. And you have these stars wrapping around you, and then reflected in these oceanic brilliance there's no way that I can explain what a feeling is to be in the middle of nowhere surrounded by that, and not be very viscerally touched and feeling completely humbled by it,
Mm-hmm.
completely humbled and blessed to be able to even see it. And Kathy says that, and this came from the little log that I kept, um, Kathy says that the core of adrift is the line, "It's a view of heaven from a seat in hell."
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's the best I can explain it, is that, a lot of these ideas and things I had maintained before, but this made it very, very real. And I don't think I was disillusioned by much of anything. I think that I felt, in terms of human relationships, that I had always expected too much of people, and that whether, no matter how troublesome humanity is, that I recognize that even I was a part of humanity, and with all my foibles, and that I had a much greater need for humanity than I ever imagined. That was a really big awakening.
Mhm. But you probably also had an awakening about what you actually need to survive in terms of resources. I mean, did that give you even a perspective on the way we're heading towards global warming and climate change, for example, or do you have some unique perspective there that came out?
I don't know. I think I knew most of that. I mean, I had read the books. I'd read the book. In a sort of intellectual way. I knew. Okay, well, hypothermia can kill you in minutes, and you need water in a matter of days. You need food in a matter of weeks, and in those. So I had those priorities kind of straightened, and like I say, I had sort of good training in a way from experience about how to deal with different kind of problems. I had knowledge. I had a lot of knowledge that was relevant. A lot of people go, "Oh, I could never survive what you went through." And I say, "Well, what are you talking about? You live in New York City. I'd perish there in a week. I just can't." I can go and visit it and whatnot, but I'm totally out of my element. You have to realize that I was kind of in my element in terms of knowing how to deal with the environment and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think I was aware of, global warming wasn't exactly a concept when I was young by a long shot. But as it emerged as an idea, certainly I had, I wasn't surprised or anything like that. And I do believe in science, and not that science is flawless. We do rewrite it, but that's actually one of the beauties of science, is that when we discover we've made a mistake, guess what? Further investigation and whatnot modifies that. I mean, it's a reasonable way of approaching life. But certainly, getting back to what we started talking about, I was, involved with a back to the land and a seasteading. As a friend of mine, designer friend of mine, coined the term seasteading, which was going on in the same time. Build your own boat, live a simple life, live in more integrated with nature. All these things were important to me from the time I was young. Living, going out camping, living out of a backpack. And you realize, I don't need a lot to survive. I don't really need, I mean, I would love to get into a Ferrari and drive it, but I don't need it. I mean, there's a huge difference between need and want. And certainly in the raft, again, it gets back to this, yeah, I was aware of these concepts, but here in a very visceral and very direct way, I'm experiencing it, which is I'm living in a rubber raft, a rubber tent, essentially, in the middle of the world's greatest wilderness, working for a few hours a day. And as long as the equipment works, I can survive. So everything else is just gravy, and to me, I'm kind of amazed here. We built our own home here, and I'm amazed by how much stuff I've collected over a lifetime. And do I need any of it? Not much. I like a lot of it, but there's a big difference.
So, in terms of a practical side of things, then, so you were catching fish, but was it just fish, or did you have other things that you were catching, or what else were you eating out there? Was it just the fish?
It was 90% Dorado. It was probably maybe even more than 90%, frankly. I would collect barnacles. I had a piece of line. I became sort of a barnacle farmer. I had a piece of line, stranded line, that I trailed out the back, which served several different functions. But one thing is the little gooseneck barnacles we grow on it. So every once in a while they get these teeny little nubs about that big, and I would scrape them off with a knife and have my barnacle burgers, as I call them. Or a little soup. I would pick at sargassum weed that would come floating by, which is kind of like a tumbleweed of the ocean. Just sort of freely floats across the surface, and all kinds of little creatures are roaming around in that, little crabs and shrimp and stuff like that. And I would pick at those. And towards the end, I was able to catch a few birds that would come and land on the top of the raft. And as weak as I was, I found that my my reflexes is actually probably as fast as they had ever been. Probably helped by fishing for the Dorado. And so I could see them kind of land on the top, the shadow land on the top of the raft. And I could grab them real quick. And they tasted pretty much like fish, and usually had a few fish in their stomachs that I would also eat. But so it was a pretty much all fish diet. And of course, my younger brother, joked with me on the way when I got home, because the question was often, well, how much weight did you lose? And it's very common for ocean survivors to lose about a third of their weight within a few weeks, which was about my status when I landed. I'd lost about a third of my weight, So my brother said, no, you shouldn't write Adrift. You should write, C.V. Callahan's Secret to Thinner Thighs in 76 Days.
Did you notice? Did you notice mental and physical changes throughout the journey?
Oh,
was it like very apparent that your body was changing?
Oh God, yeah. I looked like, well, besides the saltwater sores, which would end up being like hundreds of little open ulcers, and usually like, where you'd sit or elbows, under your arms, any place that would rub. There was that element, which was just mostly a nuisance and painful. But I started losing weight pretty quickly, and very typically I lost it. I found it amazing. I called it the demo derby of flesh. I don't know if you know what demo derbies are, but that's where basically you grab a bunch of old cars and kind of reinforce them and run around in an infield of like a soccer type stadium and bash each other to bits until the last one is left running, right? And by then they like the hood's all falling off and it's all smashed to bits. But and it's amazing that they can still keep going, because my car, if I get a low tire or a little dent in it or something, it stops working entirely. So, but you go to these, so it was, being in the rafts was kind of like a demo derby of flesh. It was amazing to see how my body adapted and kept going. In many ways, one was even psychological. Like when I dreamt, I dreamt of food and drink every single time. But it was never, I never dreamt of steak. I never dreamt of fish or anything like that. It was all the stuff that my body really needed. It was breads and fruits and vegetables and all of that stuff. And I found that kind of interesting. And I found it interesting that initially, of course, I was kind of turned off to the idea of just like stripping up fish and eating it. And sushi wasn't that popular until after that time. But I learned, actually, I was very fortunate to be given these really delicious fish. But initially I wasn't eating like the organ meats and stuff like that. But over time, actually, the psychology changed me to where at the end of the voyage, I didn't really care about the flesh that much. I was most interested in, fresh fish eyes and fresh fish liver and all the things that had the nutrients, the vitamins, the sugars, the fats, and the liquid that my body really most needed, stuff like that. So psychologically, I saw a change, and physically, of course, my legs kept getting, I wasn't using my legs very much. And so they thinned out more and more and more. If you looked at pictures of me, of course, there were no real pictures of me that you could really see my body directly after landing. And then I started retaining a lot of fluids. So I ended up looking like I had elephantiasis in my legs and feet and stuff like that. So you can't really see. But initially, my legs were really skinny with knobby knees, kind of like you see somebody who had been in a POW camp for a long time or something like that. But my upper body had remained fairly strong. You could see in the initial cover of Adrift, I went down and we kind of took some pictures of me in the raft, and you can see my muscles were still pretty well developed and whatnot, probably better than they are now for sure.
So how long did it take then? So did that mental change remain? Like, are you still able to go eat fish eyes and stomach contents and feel happy with that? And how long did it take for how long did it take for both the physical and the mental to,
I don't know. I haven't been anywhere where they're serving fish eyes, so I don't know if I could handle that or not. I mean, a lot of times I think back on some of the things I ate, and I just go like, ooh, I don't think so. But I yeah, I certainly I eat fish, and with great respect, and things like that. Physically, I had a really hard time getting around for over 6 weeks because of this problem of retention of fluid. I was really high, really low in potassium, really high in sodium. It doesn't take that long for the saltwater source to start healing up, and probably within a month or something. I mean, I still have scars and stuff, but they weren't a long-term problem. And I was very lucky in that I didn't have any other real long-term effects that I can evaluate, that anybody can evaluate in any way. I mean, maybe I did organ damage and stuff like that. I've certainly had other problems, but then again, I'm old now, almost 70 years old now, so it's different. But it took about 6 weeks before I could really start getting around reasonably well. It took 6 months actually before I was really back on my feet and had built the weight back up and muscle tissue and stuff like that. But it changed my metabolism. I couldn't, before then I was a young person eating all the time and not gaining weight. And after, I just felt like I got kicked into middle age and started losing hair. All this, I did have hair once. That was coming out like in handfuls shortly after I came back, and stuff like that. So it definitely had an effect on me, but how to quantify that exactly, I don't know.
Well, can I ask? So, in preparation for this talk, I read the Essex. I watched The Life of Pi. So, at the end of the Essex, which for people who don't know is a shipwreck from way back during the time when they were hunting for sperm whales. At the end of that book, it talks about people would hoard, the survivors hoarded food.
Right.
Did you ever have anything strange like this that
Hold
you
on,
picked
yeah.
up? Or
Yeah, I didn't go anywhere without food with me for months. I had peanut butter, I had some crackers, and I had, or, like peanuts and stuff like that. Probably a couple of chocolate bars, my favorite. Things like that. I mean, everywhere I went, I had food.
Mhm.
And that,
did that? How long did that last?
I don't remember exactly, probably till I got back to Maine anyway. I mean, then you're kind of in a place, and there is
Hmm.
food around. I mean, it is, you talk about awakenings of things. I mean, I had this friend, Jim Brown, is a wonderful designer, and who coined the term seasteading. And he was up visiting us once, I remember, and so we're going to throw together a dinner. And Jim spent a lot of times in what we normally call the third world, or the emerging nations, and Jim has always insisted is actually the two-thirds world. And so he knows what it's like to live for a lot of people in this world, and in terms of their you know food stocks, and just basics, having your basic needs met. And so we're sitting there, and Jim goes, "Oh, well, do you have some peppers?" And I open up the fridge and go, "Yeah, we do have some peppers up here." And he looked at the refrigerator, which wasn't, like a huge deal or anything by American standards. It wasn't like we were like overstocked with stuff or anything. And he just said, "What wealth! What wealth I'm looking at right here." And it's true. We are so spoiled, especially in America. Almost everybody in America, in Europe and so on. We have no idea how much wealth we surround ourselves with every day, including that food. So for me, coming back, I'm in hey, people would go, "Oh, well, like invite me over or something." Well, excuse the condition of my apartment. And I just laugh. It's just like, what? It doesn't leak, does it? It doesn't. You've got a dry space you've got cushions, you've got, you know, it's a different perspective when you go through stuff like that. And of course, you know, there is that realization, which certainly was hammered home in the raft, that, you know what, I'm in this raft, but I really have no reason to complain. You know, there's that reasonable part of me, because even here, I am probably better off than a lot of people in this world right now.
I mean, well, I don't know if that's. I mean, you could have died at any. You were down the bottom somewhere for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true. But see, I had the fish around me. I had resources. Not everybody does have resources. I had tools. Not everybody has tools or can afford the tools, and so on. You know, I had been lucky enough. You know, my parents were, you know, they liked traveling and whatnot, and like I went to Hong Kong in 1970, you know, where they had gotten several million refugees in a matter of months, and where there was dire, I mean, real dire poverty everywhere you turn, beggars and people living in conditions that just were amazing. And, you know, I was well traveled enough to know what the real bottom of our societies are in terms of their meeting their physical needs. And and that helped me too. You know, it's, you know, not that I didn't complain or feel sorry for myself and stuff like that, but there was that other realization too of what is real for a lot of people in the world.
On a practical side of things, you mentioned the Dorado hitting the underside of the boat. You were also attacked by sharks, right? During your
Yeah, yeah. I was fortunate there too in terms of comparisons to survivors in the Pacific generally. You know, some people, like I knew there was a couple of survivors, but not only the Baileys, I think, who had a lot of problems with sharks, but Bill Butler and Simone Butler, who were adrift for 66 days, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years after me, something like that, in the Pacific. And they had to learn how to live with sharks surrounding the raft and smacking at it and stuff like that 24/7, basically. So I was fortunate. I had individual encounters, and usually they were mostly interested in the ecosystem that had developed around the raft and that basically kept me alive and eventually brought my salvation. You know, sharks are predators are certainly a part of that. And so sometimes they, you know, the first one was just a hammerhead that, you know, kind of came over to check me out and fortunately just slid under the raft and wasn't interested and swam off, to, you know, ones that would come up under the raft, you know, bash the bottom of the raft and, you know, kind of goes flying off the top of the ocean a little bit, and me poking at them with my little spear trying to get them to go away and whatnot. So I had some individual experiences with them, and they were certainly not unfrightening, but you know, I was I was fortunate. I was able to drive them away with a little spear, or they'd lose interest and swim away and stuff like that. The most persistent one was when I hold the bottom tube of the raft, and it was like a buzzard, almost as if it could kind of sense that something was really wrong here, and he was just going to bide his time. But I eventually got a really good hit on him with the spear, and he just disappeared.
I guess you were probably moving around quite a lot when how much were you in the water when you had the hole in the bottom of the boat?
Oh, none,
Were you
none. I never got out of the raft. I went.
No, I mean, so did part of the raft go so that, I mean, was water entering the raft
Oh,
because
yeah,
of
yeah,
the
yeah. In terms of the raft itself, I don't know. You can picture it as I don't know. Do people know what inner tubes are anymore?
I can put up a picture of it on the screen.
Yeah, okay.
Actually,
Well,
so.
there's one tube on top of the other. And when the bottom tube was holed, it not only loses that volume of the tube, but if you look at the shape of a displaced vessel, it's that entire volume there that's keeping you afloat. So when that collapses, all of a sudden the whole raft isn't. Plus, the bottom of the raft now, water pressure is pushing those tubes up. And so there's this big bubble on the inside, which goes up to basically water level. And so it meant rather than having, like I would guess a foot, 14 inches, maybe 16 inches of freeboard, I had a couple, 2 or 3 inches of freeboard. So that meant there was a lot of water washing in and out all the time. And it made it impossible to fish. It made it impossible to produce water because I had to deal with these solar stills about every 15 minutes to get any production. It made it, moving around on the raft was like walking in rubber quicksand, and I have all these saltwater sores. And then I was worried about my legs sticking down into the ocean in this fabric for other creatures to bump them or grab them or whatever. And plus the raft is now no longer this thing lightly floating on the top of the surface of the water. It's dragging kind of through the water, and it's not really going very fast anywhere. So it was a nightmare to do it, to get it. So I was wet a lot, which wasn't helping anything. It was just awful.
All of these problems, and then a shark circling.
Yeah, just to cap it off.
Yeah. I mean, you must have just been mentally exhausted at this point. How long did you say you said it was 2 weeks to fix it, or 10
about
days or something?
10 days, I believe, before I finally got a solution. And that was it. That was working a lot. I was in the middle of the night, I was working in the middle of the day. It was just
Because you had to continuously pump it, right?
yeah, I would
Just
try
to,
to get the patch fixed and then pump up the raft, and then a couple hours, it might give me a couple of hours rest, and then a wave would hit or whatever, and the patch would blow out and let's start all over again. It really was not.
and I guess you were also losing material because when it popped out, you'd lose.
No, most of the time I was smart enough. I actually tied everything together and whatnot, and usually what would happen is it would blow out a corner of the mouth or something like that. It wouldn't like completely lose it. And usually I'd have stuff tied on. It was tied on. There were like these exterior hand lines on the raft, and part of the lashing was like involved them and whatnot. So I wasn't really losing material. And if the plug fell out, it's still closed cell foam. It floats on the surface, and I could paddle over and pick it up or whatever.
Mm-hmm. But I guess, as you mentioned, the real problem was you ultimately wanted to drift somewhere where you could be found,
Right.
and you were moving much more slowly once you had the puncture.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I figured I was making between the current was carrying me roughly 10 to 15 miles a day, depending. And the wind would carry me about the same. I think I averaged, roughly speaking, about 25 miles a day, something like that. And I would encourage that drift. The way I positioned the raft and all that other kind of stuff, but there wasn't a lot, and I could control my, I don't know, drift direction very slightly, which was important because I wanted to keep myself south, because I didn't want the currents and the winds swing towards the end of the voyage, and I could have easily missed the islands and then get swept up in the Gulf Stream and caught in the gyre taking me back to Europe again. So anyway, I was pretty
It's these
fortunate.
little.
And I was also very fortunate. I was unfortunate in that if I had drifted sort of south, I could have hit the Cabo Verde Islands in 400 miles or something or other, through a few hundred miles. Yeah, there's no longer direction I could have gone without hitting land. But I was also very fortunate in that the current and the wind were very consistent. And there was only one 24-hour period where I sort of took this 360-degree loop. But most of the time I was drifting pretty straight on to the Caribbean islands.
See, this is one of the things that if anyone without your background had been in this situation, they simply wouldn't have known how to do any of it. They wouldn't have known how to direct the boat. They wouldn't have known which direction to direct it in any case. Did you? How do you know how accurate you were with your positioning?
Yeah.
In hindsight.
Yeah, I ended up, I don't know, it's kind of complicated. Again, I go into detail in the book, but basically I made myself a pencil sextant. A sextant's really just a fancy protractor to measure angles. And I was measuring the angle of the North Star, which gave me roughly my latitude. I was worried about drifting north of 18 degrees latitude because that's where I'd miss the islands. And I was, sighting on this thing. It wasn't a very accurate piece of equipment. And I'm bobbling around in this little raft. It's hard enough on a small boat to get a decent sight. So, but generally speaking, I thought, I don't know. I think I'm about maybe 16, 17 degrees, whatever. I can't even remember what it was now. And I ended up being a little bit further south of the latitude that I calculated, and I was off on the longitude. Of course, I couldn't calculate that because I didn't have an accurate timepiece or tables or any of that other kind of stuff. But my estimation of speed and distance I was basically 100 miles away from where I thought I was, or where I hoped I was. But I wasn't sure about that either. I told myself, I said, oh, you're probably full of shit. You have no idea where you are. And especially towards the end, because I kept expecting to see the islands and I was being over optimistic about my drift westward, and they weren't showing up and they weren't showing up. There were signs that things were changing, and that, but then I thought, well, geez, I could have drifted between the islands in the middle of the night or something or other and not even known it. And so next stop, like Central America, or maybe I'm completely off and I'm actually much further north, and next stop is England. And I really had no definitive idea, but as it turned out, I was about 100 miles off.
I'd be pretty proud with that effort if I had been 100 miles off. Yeah. But has your story, a bit of a weird question, has your story, do you think, changed with the 40 years? You had the experience, then you've had to retell the story. I imagine every time you go to a bar or every time you meet someone, they ask for this story. And you're probably, do you think you've had some deviation from the 40 years ago story?
I am sure. Memory is not accurate, as we all know. I think my advantage in terms of the story being, it's two things here, because I have a note in the introduction of Adrift, that, there's a difference between story and reality. Story is a perspective, and it can try in language. It uses language, which is not reality, right? It has, I've spent probably half of a 50-year career writing, and I will tell you that words fail all the time. So I can impart an impression, I can impart a story, but that's not exactly what it was. I will guarantee you that it was truly a hellish experience. It doesn't mean that I don't find things of value that I would prefer be the story, that are more important than the pain and the suffering and things like that. To me, that is part of the story. Story is, perspective. It's not just what happens. And in terms of that, I think the story of Adrift, the reality is what it was. That's never going to change. My memory of it is colored by the story that I constantly tell myself about it. But that's been very consistent, in part because I started writing the story down even when I was in the raft. That I felt like I'm probably not going to make it, but maybe somebody will discover the raft and there will be something here that I write down that may be of some value to other mariners. That base, that real base, that's what it was. And when I came back, I had nothing. And a magazine asked me to write an article about it. And so that was, an opportunity for me to do something that would make me a few bucks and would help me to create a story. And story to me is an essential human need. Like I said, the pads of paper to me were one of the most important bits of survival gear, because they allowed me to start story, to be able to kind of separate myself from the experience to a certain degree and to say, oh, you know what? Yeah, despite the fact that my body and stuff was suffering, I can still observe and note that wasn't this incredible today? This happened or that happened, or I saw this or this idea occurred to me or whatever. And that's what we do with life is story gives us context, it gives us meaning. And in terms of that, I don't think that's changed a whole lot. When I started writing Adrift, what I did is I took all those notes and I spread them out on the bed. And I kind of separated them into, this is practically what happened. Day one, I had this much water, I ate, I caught a fish, whatever. And on this side, I'm putting all the notes about what did I think about? What did I, how did I feel? And so on and so forth. And those kind of made patterns to me that created the chapters of Adrift. And I don't think that's that part of the story, that memory, if you will, has really changed a whole lot. There's certain things have gotten heightened or changed in certain ways because I've gotten older. I bring a different kind of perspective to it than I did when I was 30 years old, but it's not really that much different.
I mean, one of the reasons why I'm curious to ask is because, I mean, for those who don't know, you worked on The Life of Pi, you were advising on The Life of Pi. And this is sort of a theme that goes through the movie. I was wondering, did you impart something like this on that movie? Is this something that comes from you, or because I haven't read the book?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you would pick up a copy of The Life of Pi and a copy of Adrift and read them next to each other, you will see a lot of parallels within The Life of Pi. Obviously, the author of that book it's allegorical fantasy. I consider them both sort of mirrors of one another in a strange kind of way. The Life of Pi is about some Indian boy who gets trapped on a lifeboat with a tiger and a menagerie of animals, and drifts for ages and so on. And so it's an allegorical fantasy, and I consider Adrift a nonfiction allegory, really. And whether it's specific passages or concepts, you'll find reflections in there. I certainly did. I had a sailing friend who sent me a copy of Life of Pi. My wife and I were actually living on a boat in Australia, refitting a boat there. And she sent me a copy of Life of Pi, and she says, look on page something or other, because I'm mentioned along with, William Bly and a few other people. And, so I'm reading it and I'm going, oh, well, that's preposterous. That could never happen. But how could I make it happen? How could I make that scene in the book kind of believable? And then ironically, years later in 2008, I think it was, I got a call from Ang Lee, basically the director, wonderful guy and incredibly talented director. And he wanted to come up and talk about the possibility of making this film. And so we did then, and then I ended up, they ended up getting the green light a couple of years later, and I went to Taiwan and was very involved with the making of the film. So there are reflections in the story, the basic story of Life of Pi. But then when Ang asked me to come work on the film, there were a couple of basic concepts that I think were key. One is, he said, well, I want you to come to Taiwan and help us make the movie. I want to make the ocean into a character, a major character. And I don't know of any other film that has really done this. Almost all ocean set films use the ocean as a stage, and that's it. And most of them look lifeless, like a stage. They don't, they rely entirely on the actors and everything else to bring life to it. But it is not a character itself. And we worked very hard at bringing the ocean alive, to show it in its many, many forms and moods, and to use those to help tell the story, to reflect the moods and changes in the story itself. And the other thing he said when I got to Taiwan was, I said, well, Ang, what do you want me to do? And he said, well, I want you to make the movie better. And I said, well, that's That's great. I appreciate that you think I could do that, but it's not very specific guidance. Can you be any more specific?
It's a lot of latitude.
Yeah, and he says, well, I want you to bring authenticity to it and to make it believable. So my role was always to lobby for what was real, which of course is not always in sync with what everybody else needs, the cameraman's lighting or whatever it is. But that was my primary role, was to try to bring authenticity to it and make it real. And I'd make props and design props, and like the little raft the raft he created, I had a big role in that. And but even setting up for scenes, or I ended up basically directing the wave tank, doing wave tank tests and studies, and in trying to provide him with different kind of sea surfaces, the suit, and all this stuff. It went on and on and on. But it was really interesting for me that they're 30 years after me drifting around in the ocean, that I was given the opportunity to bring to new audiences in a totally different art form, the through the Life of Pi, a very legitimate, great novel in its own right. But to bring something of the spirit of the Dorado and my experiences on the raft to film in that way. And it was a great privilege to work on the film. I was very proud of being involved with it, and all the people who worked on it, who were incredibly talented and brought their A game to it. So anyway.
It just seems, your story seems to fit. So I don't know if this is because you worked on the movie, but the two stories, as you say, seem to sort of weave into one another. The fact that you had this sort of view of the Dorados that you did, the Mahi Mahi, as being some sort of like your savior, and then in the movie itself, you had the zoo aspect and all the animals.
Oh, they had the Dorado. They had the Dorado too. Remember, we had Dorado.
Yeah.
That was a part of it. And but overall, there's that's a very good example of how the stories kind of parallel. And in the Life of Pi, as he gets to, we go through the stages of survival, first of all, in a way that I've been talking about, the same kinds of things that I went through, an adaptation, feeling like, oh, and then you have the very big ups and downs, and, the budding relationship with the environment, basically. And there's a scene looking down on the lifeboat in Life of Pi, and all these fish and sea creatures like all around it, and so on. And they are, they're part of that ecosystem. The raft that the life, that Pi builds, and how he adapts it, and is he gets to, first of all, he doesn't know how to live out there, and then after a while he's sitting there, and he's sitting in his chair. We made him this like real comfy chair that the actor actually would fall asleep in between takes sometimes, because it got really comfy. And but the character itself, himself, actually got very at ease there. At some point, he's playing drums, and he's watching the dolphin jump and stuff like that. And so he's going through a lot of the same emotions and the same stages, and the relationship with the environment is a very big part of both stories. And there is even a specific scene that relates to what I was talking about before, the A View of Heaven from a Seat in Hell. Because I was telling Aang about different, realities at sea, and I was saying, well, one thing that happens very rarely, the sea is always alive. It always kind of has this breath to it, and we always try to use that in the film. It's never just flat like a stage. But there are times where it's been very smooth for a number of days, and you get these incredible reflections where you can't, at night especially, it's very difficult to see, you see no clear horizon, and where the stars are very bright. So you have the Milky Way like coming overhead and dipping down to the sea and almost wrapping around you. And you feel like you're literally in space, like you're floating in space. And I wrote about this in my little log. I actually had the life raft looking like a little flying saucer going through the space, And there's a scene in Life of Pi, which is kind of, we call it the tiger vision scene, where the boy is now real wild. He's become the the wild creature himself. And he's looking down through the ocean with the tiger, and they're kind of the fantasy of all the different creatures and all that. And then it pans back, and it pans way back. And in the middle of the screen, you see this teeny, teeny, teeny little lifeboat surrounded in stars. So that's one of the scenes. I brought a few scenes, specific scenes, and I mean, I had some influence in scenes, but another one was the whale that is so iconic, jumping up out of the ocean. Of course, it comes down across the raft, but that actually was inspired by a delivery I did many years later in 1985, where I was on deck by myself, and this mother and baby whale just came straight up out of the ocean, about 100 yards away from the boat, just streaming bioluminescence, and boom, back into the ocean. And I'm like, and I had, a crew with me at the time, and I went down to wake him up, and he was, and so I was the only person in the universe to see that at that time. And it just made me, that's one of those visceral things where it's like, oh my God, I just saw something that nobody else has probably ever seen before.
How well did the movie capture that, the image that you saw then?
Oh, it was quite different because, I was just there, a passenger, in reality, I had been a passenger, just going by, and there it was. And it was just that feeling of being in the middle of nowhere, but in the exact right time, in the exact right place to see that. So I think it captured that, but of course it was different, applied in a different kind of way in the film.
I guess also in the film, he was trying to signal to boats, and you also had you weren't able to get the attention, the 9 boats that you saw. How did you eventually get rescued? So you drifted over towards, I suppose, the Caribbean, and
Yeah.
and where were you in the end when you were rescued?
I was just off of the island of Marie Gallant, which was named after, I guess, Christopher Columbus's second voyage to the Americas. It's just off of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, just north of Dominica. It's a small island. It's not really a tourist island. And I got up close. The night before, I started seeing light, the loom of lights, and I thought, oh, maybe they're, but there were a lot of them, quite a few of them. So I thought, oh, well, maybe it's a fishing fleet, which is a good sign. But they were quite far off, and I kept getting up because I could only maybe catch an hour of sleep at a time before I cramp up or whatnot. And so I constantly getting up and looking around, and the Luma light, they were basically there and there and there, and they didn't really seem to move. And then I saw a pulse of a lighthouse, so I knew that I was close to land. And the next morning I could see the island, some details in the island, and I was closer than I thought I was, but I was going to be a really dangerous landing because the north half of the island was all coral cliffs with 3,000 miles of ocean smashing into it, and the south side of the island was it had a beautiful beach, but coral reef outlying the beach, which would have been really difficult to get across in one piece. So I was kind of preparing myself, and well, maybe I can paddle along, influence my drift enough and get around the south side of the island and land in the lee of the island or something like that. And then I heard this, engine from an outboard, and looked out, and there was a boat coming up to me, and 3 guys in it. And what I didn't realize immediately, but would later be aware of, was that they had come out to find fish, in fishermen being smart guys, and being what a friend of mine calls naturally literate. They come out and they saw all kinds of birds hovering above the raft, and they knew, oh, there's probably fish out there. And they never fished on that side of the island before, but they decided to that day. They hadn't been very successful on the other side of the islands. And so they came out to find the fish, and they found me. And the only reason, frigate birds were hovering above the raft, because their primary food is flying fish, which is the primary food of the Dorado. And they see the Dorado, and they actually almost work together sometimes. Like Dorado will, drive the flying fish out of the water, and the frigates will dive and grab the flying fish. So again, it was, part of this, the story, if you will, which hasn't changed, which is, how the Dorado became my companions and spiritual creatures, and fed me and almost killed me, but in the end brought my salvation as well. And so they took me into the island, and that was the end of that story.
What was the feeling when you when you first saw the island and you heard and saw this boat? What was going through your head? What did you have?
I'm not sure if I can't give you the entire story. You got to read it.
Yeah, okay. But it
Because
was a
there
good
actually
feeling.
is there is kind of key element of that of how I felt, and I did something which probably kind of surprised me as well, honestly. But it made perfect sense to me at the time. It concluded. I've been through life, and I've had many. I call them whole experiences. Sometimes they're within 24 hours. I'm sure everybody has this kind of thing where you go through something and it has a pretty well defined beginning, a middle, and an end,
Hmm.
and it all seems to come together and make sense to you in both in your head and in your heart. And this was one of those times where it was almost like that was a miracle to me, that
Hmm.
these guys came out, they found me, it was definitive end, and and it tied up all the loose ends, so to speak.
Hmm.
So
And so when so you've got on the
I was
wall behind.
exhausted, I'll tell you that. I was pretty tired.
Well, you'd have to be after 76 days. But
Yeah.
so on the wall behind you, you have your spear gun and what you were using to catch the Dorado.
Yeah.
What else did you? So where is the raft now? What do you have a bunch of stuff that you kept a hold of, or
No, that's pretty much it. This is my disaster corner of my office, actually. I think it's a good
you've had other
background for this.
disasters
I've,
that?
I've got everything's different everywhere else. I've got, photos of boats, and I have a Dorado skeleton above the door over there that was given to me by the prop master in Life of Pi, with whom I worked pretty closely for a long time. Just a beautiful structure, natural design. But I don't have much of anything other than the spear gun right now, and there's an illustration there of me
Mhm.
drifting up to the island and so on. But the raft, my parents boxed up. They came down to the islands shortly after I landed, and they boxed it up. And Peabody Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, has that in a box. It's probably all rotten now, I imagine. It was natural rubber. But they also have the ditch kit and a lot of the gear that I have. I had a little bit of other stuff which has been given to Mystic Seaport Museum. They also have my original log, and all kinds of other memorabilia having to do with, the publication of Adrift and all that stuff. So I don't have much anymore. I'm in dispersal mode now.
Mhm.
Like I say, I'm almost 70. I've come close to death many times in my life now. And so the reality is that this is all going someplace. So most of it's gone already.
Mhm. Do you have could you tell me, okay, so when you first had that first meal after getting back, what was the first shower like? What was the first, when you were suddenly walking and able to stretch out your legs and you're able to sleep in a bed? How did that feel?
Incredible. I mean, talk about heaven on earth. Oh my God. Um, well, first of all, I had incredible. Yeah, anybody who's been on a boat for a while, like you go out for an afternoon, even, or maybe a day or something, and you come back, and maybe you're standing in front of the urinal, and the whole room's spinning or whatever, and you got that motion in your head. So my motion was really intense. I couldn't. First of all, I had a hard time standing up. In fact, I fell face first on the beach when I first got out of the boat, and so yeah, and like if I wanted to walk 100 feet, I would be almost literally bouncing off the walls of both edges of a room before I got to the door, that kind of thing, and that lasted for quite a while. But they took me to the hospital in Marie Gallant, which was, I'm not going to go into all the detail there because part of it was kind of funny. But they brought me food. First of all, the doctor comes and he goes, well, you've been out in this raft and I don't think we can give you solid food or anything like that. I said, well, wait a minute, wait right there. No, I want to eat. And I told them that I'd been eating fish and stuff like that, but they wanted to be careful because you can overdo it as somebody who'd been starving for quite a while. And but they brought me this tray of food in that had root crops and all this stuff. Every single one was just incredible. I'm telling you, I felt like in a general sense, I felt like all of my senses were plugged into an electric socket. Everything was like day glow colors almost. Anything that wasn't blue, red flower, anything was like mind blowing. And I could just, and even when I was in the room, there was a guy down in the kitchen of the hospital washing dishes and stuff and singing. Beautiful voice. And just to hear that was just like bring tears to my eyes. It was just incredible. All these miracles we're surrounded with all the time that we don't appreciate, and I certainly was appreciating everything. And but the anesthesiologist at the hospital, who was from France, and she had heard I had landed. I guess there was a bit of hubbub around about this weirdo who came across the ocean. And she invited me to her home that night for dinner. And she came very kindly with a basket of food and stuff to the hospital in case I couldn't move. I said, no, I want to get out of here. I want to go. I want to have life,
Yeah.
And so she took me back to their place, which was wonderful. I had ratatouille, incredible. Took a hot shower the next day. It was like the next morning. Looking like Robinson Crusoe. Cut my beard, all that stuff. It was fantastic to be amongst people, to have luxury, to have a comfy place to sleep that wasn't wet. All of that, simple things, but just great stuff.
Are you able to channel that a little bit? You go out into the fields and you see a red flower, or the sun's coming through your window, hitting you as you're asleep in your bed in the morning. And can you sort of remember that moment, sort of channel it and get back to it a little bit to some
To a
extent?
certain degree. I mean, like I say, everything fades in time. You start grumbling about the same old stuff and things like that. There is a part of me that, just like I had different voices on the boat, there are different voices in my head all the time too. I mean, maybe I'm a schizophrenic, I don't know, but they can remind me. They can remind me when I take a shower about how much water I'm using. It's going down the drain. That just snuggling up to my wife at night, what a luxury that is, and how blessed I am. So yeah, talking about it, actually, sometimes right now I'm feeling pretty teary-eyed sometimes. I had a couple of guys out here, I don't know, it's probably 3 or 4 years ago, I guess, something. There's a documentary being produced about adrift now, and he was out here filming stuff. And at the time, I had the log and all that stuff, and I hadn't looked at it in 30 years, 40, whatever it is. And so he had me reading bits and pieces out of it, and it took me emotionally. It takes me right back there. I can be back there sometimes. I don't really, like I say, I like, I appreciate being able to talk about the story of adrift, about the things of value that I witnessed and felt about it. But I don't want to be there either, because it really was a view of heaven from a seat in hell in many ways. So yes and no.
Yeah. No, I was just hoping that you could pull some of the heaven across with you through your life.
Oh, definitely,
Has
definitely.
your
When I get teary-eyed, it's not because I'm unhappy. It's because I recognize this is something that really changed for me when I came back and I saw two people just relating in a way, holding hands in a touching way, people being kind to one another. Those are the things that really move me. and
Hmm.
take me back to the opposite of that, that was in the raft.
Hmm.
That really gave me a perspective of what is of real value.
Hmm. Can I ask, when you first were interacting with people, the conversations you were you having, were you just flowing in words, or was it hard to start talking again after 76 days of not speaking to anyone?
No, I never really was, I hated talking in public, and even getting up in a group of 4 or 5 people and saying anything was petrifying to me. But I think I've always been a bit of a blabbermouth, and uh, you know,
Well, you tell a good story.
people are often kind of shocked by single-handed sailors because we go off in periods of fairly long periods of time being alone, but we're all pretty gregarious when we get together, around the bar or whatever. And I was so delighted to be back on terra firma, to not have any wants, and to people were being very kind to me, and all of that. So I was happy to talk about it, and did.
Mm. So, following the event, where have you been? You got back into the boats, and you carried on. So, what's the furthest you traveled? What's your favorite trip? What's
Oh, geez,
your
that's impossible to say. I don't rank things like that. I love different experiences, and some of them are just fantastic experience. Sailing across the Pacific with my friend Russell on his proa was definitely a highlight of my life. It's a very, very simple boat, basically an ocean-going canoe, and it's something that people hadn't really done before. I've done a number of things, some of them bigger things, some of them quite tiny things that very few people, or maybe nobody's done before. Life of Pi is a perfect example. I mean, it was
Mm,
a film that 3 directors kind of gave up, that Hollywood thought was, quote, unfilmable. And
mm,
we were doing a lot of things. The joke on the set was, um, well, the adage in the movie business is never make a movie with kids, animals, or on the water. So we're doing all three, and in 3D, which was kind of a newish technology.
mm,
So there were lots of challenges doing that. That was wonderful, doing something, being involved with such a huge project that an individual can never do. That is a very collaborative effort, and anything can go wrong. Any one thing can go wrong. One person not giving it a their all can screw up the whole project, but it amazingly comes together. Writing Adrift, doing that, even doing the tours, which I thought I was going to be really freaked out and horrified by. I learned a lot from that. I came back, basically. A guy who I'd been employed with part time before. I was doing my own designs and working in a design office and teaching design, and he offered me that job back. So I came back, and I was working with him part time, writing the book part time, living in dire poverty all the time for another 4 or 5 years. I met my wife. That in itself has just been incredible voyage. She's my best mate, both onshore and off. Um, I started writing a lot more, covering maritime stuff, single-handed sailing, leading technologies, all this stuff. I'm interested both in the technical aspects of things and the conceptual aspects of things, and I kind of combine them. Um, and that took me all over the world, interviewing really incredible people doing amazing work. I don't know, it just goes on and on. I've had this happened to me when I've been through serious illnesses. Um, uh, I The last one was waiting my way through leukemia, which is kind of a gift that keeps on giving. Um, I've been close to death. I'm the only survivor of a particular trial, clinical trial. So I've seen a lot for a guy my age, and a lot of it's been difficult, and a lot of it's been wonderful. But even the difficult bits have given me a lot. So no regrets on this end for sure.
Has it has your outlook been sort of forever shifted by this event? In your survival of leukemia in this clinical trial, for example, do you think your perspective was useful there,
Oh,
or?
absolutely, a lot of parallels, and that overall a lot of what I've done, both in a kind of techie specific way. I've done a lot of work with safety, survival, and seamanship in my field. But it's also taken me outside of my field. I've been involved with all kinds of survivors, people who've been, let's say, just a smattering, a film crew that crashed into a volcano, people buried by avalanches, people who live in abusive homes. I got involved with a children's home that deals with youth at risk, everything from, you know, classroom bullies and in gangs to kids who are really badly abused at young ages. I've seen all of these things and learned a lot. And the more I see, the more I realize that we're all kind of in the same boat all the time. I mean, we just don't always realize it because it's not so critical all the time. And so, yeah, my perspective was changed for sure. And I'm very happy in many ways that I went through the drifting experience at age 30, because life is full of these challenges. Nobody gets, as I said, nobody gets out of here alive. And in whether it's psychological survival, physical survival, emotional survival, we all go through the same thing. And that's something else that Kathy, my wife, brilliantly said while I was writing Adrift. She says, just remember, we don't all have the same experiences, but we all have the same feelings. And it's true. We go through the same stuff. So yeah, I learned a lot that was really valuable for the rest of my life. I knew the difference. I still know the difference between, wants and needs. And it's an important thing to know. And what I can get away, what I can do and what I can't do, and what is important to, focus on, and what I can give up. Not that I'm always good at that, but, at least the lessons are there and I can go back to it.
If for a sort of a final wrap up message, if you have some insight on, for people who are going through a rough patch, so in Corona times, for example, there's a lot of depression. People are going through different troubles, losing their jobs, things like this. In general, for people who are going through something where they don't think they can continue, or where they're really, getting piled on by the world in some way, everyone's got their own sort of things to deal with. Do you have any advice for people sort of going through hell?
As Winston Churchill so once brilliantly put it, when going through hell, keep going. Put one step in front of the other. As I've said, no survivor I've met has ever thought at the beginning that they were definitely going to make it. That, in fact, few of us do. Most of us think, well, this is it. We're kind of screwed here. But despite that, we put that aside. We have the end goal in mind, but we don't, it's not fixed, first of all, because life is going to take us a different kind of way, and might take us to a surprising end that might be completely different from our goal. But even with my goal being the islands, I have it in mind, but what I'm focusing on is where I am. It's a very present kind of thing, dealing with what I have to do right now, and what is the achievable step. That really becomes the whole focus. In a way, it's kind of a very Zen-like existence, where the past, yes, you have that vision of the past and everything, but you know what? You can put it aside because it is past. You're not going to do anything about that. There is a future, but you're not there yet. what is it that I can achieve now that will be positive and get me towards that direction? And touching the void, a guy falls into this crevasse, he's all broken up. He needs to get down the mountain, but he's not thinking about, oh, the whole way down the mountain, what am I going to do after that? He's focusing, how do I get to the next rock down the hill? And that's the same with me, and that's the same with attacking any large project or anything. We have the goal in mind, but we really want to reach the achievable goal right now. And if you just keep doing it, time stacks up, that stacks up. Also, forgive yourself. Sometimes you're going to fail. Sometimes you're going to screw up, and don't be afraid to say, oh, okay, fine. It's, I screwed up. I made a mistake. One of the wealthiest men I ever personally knew said that, he says, I learned a long time ago, accept when you've made a mistake and cut your losses right there. It's a hard thing to do, because it's like playing poker. Do I take another card and stay in for another round and maybe that will be the card? But, all great poker players know what the chances are. And it's like, nope, that's it. I'm done, and so it's the same way with life, in survival in particular.
Escaped Sapiens.